The world owes $315 trillion. That's 3 times the entire global economy. Every government, every corporation, every household combined couldn't pay it back even if they wanted to. And here's what nobody tells you. They never intended to. This isn't a crisis waiting to happen, it's the design. The debt was never meant to be repaid. It was meant to grow, forever. This is Treasury Tales, where the numbers tell stories that nobody wants you to hear. And today's story begins with a lie so big, so foundational, that the entire global economy is built on top of it. The lie is simple: debt is temporary. Borrow now, pay later. Eventually the books balance. That's what they taught you in school. That's what politicians promise during elections. That's what makes the nightly news when countries talk about fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets. But if you look at the actual numbers, a different picture emerges. Global debt hasn't decreased in over 40 years. It's tripled since the year 2000 alone. Every recession adds trillions. Every recovery adds more. When COVID hit, governments worldwide borrowed $20 trillion in a single year. Did anyone ask where that money came from? Or more importantly, when would it be paid back? The answer is never, because the system isn't broken. This is exactly how it's supposed to work. To understand why $315 trillion in debt can never be repaid, we need to understand what debt actually is in the modern financial system. And that requires going back to a moment when everything changed. August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. It was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. That single decision severed the last tie between money and anything physical. From that moment forward, money became debt. And debt became money. Here's what that means in practice. Before 1971, when a government wanted to spend, it needed gold reserves or tax revenue. There was a physical limit to how much it could borrow. But after Nixon closed the gold window, money became purely abstract. A government could issue bonds. Central banks could buy those bonds with newly created currency, and boom, money materialized. Not from mines or vaults, but from promises. Every dollar in your pocket today isn't backed by gold, silver, or anything tangible, it's backed by debt. Specifically, the debt of the United States government. Your cash is someone's IOU, and that IOU is only valuable because everyone agrees to pretend it is. This is the foundation of fiat currency. And once you understand it, the $315 trillion starts to make sense. It's not money owed in the traditional sense. It's the scoreboard of a game where debt and money are the same thing, wearing different masks. But let's get specific. Let's follow the thread. If the world owes $315 trillion, who holds the other end? Start with governments. They owe roughly $90 trillion combined. The US leads with $38 trillion. Japan carries over $10 trillion. China, despite being seen as the world's creditor, owes more than $14 trillion domestically. Even Germany, the poster child of fiscal discipline, holds $2.8 trillion in public debt. Then there's corporate debt, another $100 trillion. Apple, Amazon, and Tesla all carry billions in bonds. Not because they're struggling, but because debt is cheaper than using their own cash. Borrowing at 3% when you can invest at 7% isn't a problem. It's a strategy. Add household debt. Mortgages, credit cards, student loans. That's another $60 trillion globally. And the rest? Financial institutions borrow from each other, derivatives, shadow banking, debts layered on top of debts. Now here's where it gets strange. When you add up who owes and who's owed, you find something impossible. The world owes money to itself. Governments owe bondholders. Bondholders are pension funds. Pension funds are funded by workers. Workers pay taxes. Taxes service the debt. It's a perfect loop. Except it's not equal. Someone's making money on this arrangement, and that someone isn't you. Let's talk about interest. Because that's where the $315 trillion stops being abstract and starts being profit. Governments don't just owe the principal. They owe interest, perpetually. The United States alone paid over $1 trillion in interest last year. That's more than it spent on education, veterans, and transportation combined. Where does that $1 trillion go? To bondholders, insurance companies, pension funds, foreign governments, sovereign wealth funds. The wealthiest individuals and institutions on the planet. They don't need the money back. They need the interest to keep flowing. Because that interest is the rent they charge for stability. Here's the magic trick. When a government issues a bond, it promises to pay you back in 10, 20, or 30 years. But when that bond matures, the government doesn't pay it off with tax revenue. It issues a new bond. It refinances. The debt rolls over. The bondholder gets paid from the next bondholder. It's a financial perpetual motion machine, and it works. Until it doesn't. Japan is the perfect case study. Its debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 260%. That means the government owes more than twice what the entire country produces in a year. By any reasonable standard, Japan should have collapsed decades ago. And yet, its bond yields remain near zero. Investors still lend. The yen is still trusted. Why? Because Japan borrows in its own currency. It controls its own central bank. And as long as the Bank of Japan keeps buying bonds, the system continues. The debt doesn't disappear. It migrates to the central bank's balance sheet, where it sits, quietly, indefinitely. Japan's debt will never be repaid, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be believed. That's the core insight. Debt in the modern system isn't about repayment. It's about belief, confidence, trust. As long as investors believe a government will pay interest, the principle becomes irrelevant. The debt can grow infinitely, as long as faith doesn't break. But what backs that faith? That's where the story gets darker. Sovereign debt is considered the safest asset in the world. Safer than cash, safer than gold. Why? Because governments can print money. They can tax citizens. They control armies, police, courts. A government bond isn't just a financial instrument. It's a claim on future violence. The power to compel payment through law. That's why when Greece defaulted in 2010, the European Central Bank didn't just let it fail. They restructured, imposed austerity, cut pensions, raised taxes. Because if Greece was allowed to walk away, the entire illusion collapses. Every other debtor nation would ask, why are we paying? The creditors don't want their money back. They want the payments to continue, forever, and they have the institutional power to ensure it. Now zoom out. If no country can actually repay its debt, and the system depends on rolling it over indefinitely, then what's stopping the debt from growing forever? Nothing, that's the point. The debt is designed to grow. Because in a fiat system, debt is how new money enters the economy. When a government borrows, it spends. That spending becomes someone's income. That income gets deposited in banks. Banks lend it out. The money multiplies. More debt creates more money, creates more economic activity. This is why central banks panicked in 2008. The financial crisis wasn't just about banks failing. It was about debt collapsing. When Lehman Brothers went under, trillions of dollars in debt-based assets evaporated overnight. And because debt is money, that meant the money supply itself was vanishing. Deflation loomed. The entire system teetered. The solution? Create more debts. Central banks bought trillions in bonds. Governments borrowed and spent. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $800 billion to over $9 trillion. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England all did the same. They didn't save the economy, they saved the debt. And it worked, for now. But every rescue comes with a cost. Every time the system is bailed out, the debt grows larger. The next crisis requires an even bigger intervention. It's an addiction, and like all addictions, the dose keeps increasing. Here rests the uncomfortable question. What happens when the debt gets so large that even the interest can't be paid? We're starting to see the cracks. The U.S. pays $1 trillion a year in interest. That number is projected to hit $1.7 trillion by 2034. At that point, interest payments will exceed defense spending. They'll rival Social Security and Medicare combined. Where does that money come from? More borrowing, which creates more interest, which requires more borrowing. It's a debt spiral. Some economists argue we can grow our way out. If GDP rises faster than debt, the ratio improves. But global growth is slowing. Productivity is stagnant. Populations are aging. And every simulation shows the same result. Without a major structural change, the debt becomes unsustainable within decades. Others say inflation is the escape hatch. If governments inflate their currencies, the real value of debt decreases. $1 trillion today isn't worth what it was in 1980, so technically, inflation is a form of default. A slow, invisible one. Your savings lose value. Wages stagnate. but the debt becomes easier to service. It's a transfer of wealth from savers to debtors, from the middle class to institutions, and that brings us to the real answer of who profits. Because while nations drown in debt and citizens struggle with inflation, a small group thrives, the financial elite. The 1% of the 1%. Those who own the debt, not owe it. When interest rates rise, bondholders profit. When governments print money, asset prices soar. Stocks, real estate, fine art, all inflated by cheap credit. The wealthy borrow at low rates, invest at high returns, and compound their wealth while the rest of the population services the system through taxes and inflation. This isn't conspiracy, it's structure. The system is working exactly as designed. Debt concentrates wealth upward. Always has, always will. Because those who own the IOUs control the future income of entire nations. Let me give you a number that crystallizes this. The richest 1% of the world now owns 45% of all global wealth. 50 years ago, it was 25%. What changed? Debt exploded, and with it, inequality. Because debt isn't distributed evenly. When a government borrows $1 trillion, that money flows to contractors, corporations, and financial institutions first. By the time it trickles down to wages and services, most of it has already been captured. The people who service the debt through taxes never see the benefits of the borrowing. They just pay the rent, so who's the creditor? Not China, not Japan. Not your pension fund. The creditor is a system. A self-perpetuating loop where money is created as debt, debt is refinanced eternally, and interest payments flow upward to a narrow band of institutions and individuals who've mastered the game. They don't want repayment. Repayment would end the game. They want the system to continue, forever. And here's the final twist. The system can't actually continue forever. Exponential growth in a finite world is mathematically impossible. At some point, the debt exceeds the capacity of economies to service it. At some point, confidence breaks. And when it does, the reset will be violent. History is full of these moments. The Roman Empire debased its currency until collapse. Weimar Germany printed into hyperinflation. The Soviet Union dissolved under economic strain. Every empire that relies on unsustainable debt eventually faces a reckoning. The question isn't if, it's when. And who pays the price when the music stops? Will it be another bailout, where taxpayers cover the losses of banks and bondholders? Will it be austerity, where pensions are cut and public services vanish? Will it be inflation, where your savings evaporate silently? Or will it be outright default, where governments simply walk away and start over? Nobody knows. But what we do know is this. The $315 trillion will never be repaid. It was never supposed to be. The game is to keep it rolling, keep the interest flowing, and keep enough people believing in the system that it doesn't collapse all at once. That's the $300 trillion lie. Not that we owe too much, but that we ever plan to pay it back. The debt is the system. The system is the debt. And as long as you're on the paying side instead of the collecting side, you're funding a machine that was never built for you. If this changed how you see the economy, hit subscribe. At Treasury Tailies, we follow the money to the places they don't want you to look, because the numbers don't lie. But the people who control them do.